Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. I'm your host, Jamie Gale. Today's guest is Raymond Kraut, an exceptional luthier whose work blurs the lines between science and art. In this conversation, Raymond and I dive deep into the evolving craft of guitar making, from the physics of sound and the role of alternative tonewoods like desert ironwood, to the emotional and instinctual layers of artistic expression. We unpack the science behind sound ports, the elegance of aesthetic design, and the sensory journey of shaping tone with wood. Raymond also shares his insights from 2 decades of building instruments, navigating the balance of fatherhood, mentorship, and running a business rooted in ethics and curiosity. This is a story about guitars, but more than that, it's about listening closely to the wood, to the music, and to yourself. It was a pleasure to have Raymond Kraut on the show. I hope that you enjoyed as much as I did. Hey, Ray. It's nice to see you.
Good morning, Jamie. Good to see you also.
Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you for the invite.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. It's I may be coming out a little heavy here, but I recently did let's say an exploration of the more extreme creative guitar makers, and realized that many of them, I don't know, I don't think that we're coming up with as many people coming up the pipe. And I started to think about when did they step out? When did they really distinguish themselves from their peers? When did that happen? Was it from the beginning? Did they have 20, 30, 40 years in their career before they really stepped out? There's a variation. There's a number of different iterations of that. But when I thought about the people who are doing something that is quite interesting, that has the potential to really distinguish themselves from their peers, I thought of your more recent work, which triggered this conversation. And so I've been really impressed with what you've been doing in the last, I don't know, is it 1 year, 2 years? It's been since you've sort of forsaken the, well, not that you've forsaken completely the regular round sound hole, but you know what I'm talking about.
I do. It's been an ongoing process over the last few years. And like you were saying, for myself, I got started in this over 20 years ago now. And from day one in my career, I wanted to be more unique with my designs. I fear redundancy in my life. And so I wanted to have something on a guitar that could be unique every time I build one, never duplicating the same design twice. And at the same time, I wanted a guitar to be a guitar. I didn't want to step outside of the bounds and make something that perhaps sounded not as good as what a traditional guitar would sound like. And I'll say I was satisfied with that for quite a while in my career. And like other things in my life, after a certain duration of time, I mean, if I'm being honest, I just got bored with it. And it wasn't enough to satisfy the artistic person inside of myself. And at the same time, I reached a point in my career where how to phrase this correctly? I want to do this for me. And I want to take less outside input as to what goes on into the guitar and have it be a true creation of myself. And with that came not taking custom orders for the instrument, building outside of my build list. And that obviously has taken some time. I got to fulfill orders that I have, but at the same time create this need that I have within myself to express these ideas I've had. And I've had them since day one. I just didn't have the ability really to pull it off, both financially speaking and courageously speaking. You know, especially 20 years ago, there wasn't as much room for creativity within the guitar. It didn't feel like it back then. Whereas now there's a lot more openness within people's imagination to kind of go outside the realm of what a traditional guitar looks like, feels like, plays like, sounds like, the whole spectrum. And yeah, I've just taken that and rolled with it. And at this point, I feel a little unleashed with it. When I first started it a few years back, I wanted to go pretty slowly with it. I wanted to take it step by step because I learned from my mentor a lot of theory about energy inside of an acoustic guitar and a lot of theory of what is a good thing and what's a bad thing. And over the past couple of decades, what I've learned is that theory doesn't always match reality. Some things can make a difference and some things really don't. And for a long time, I never put sound ports on my guitars because in theory, that wouldn't be a good thing for the acoustic instrument. I just read into it, never experimented with it, trusted what I had been told. And I think it was maybe 10 years into my career was the first time someone really talked me into putting one in. And it was a bit of an aha moment for me because even though my stubbornness really didn't want to do it, my particular client at the time really was pushing me to do it and he really wanted it. And so I went ahead and did it despite my concerns about it. And in the end, I string this guitar up and play it for the first time. And I said to myself, why haven't I been doing this all along? I should have been doing this a decade ago. And ever since that moment, I've been on a bit of a path of trying to distinguish for myself what really makes a difference and what doesn't make a difference, despite the theory. And when I started this, again, a few years back, I wanted to take it slowly and understand for myself with some of these more radical designs, what makes a difference in real life. What can we hear? What can't we hear? What can I get away with for the sake of art and visual stimulus and not affect the tone that people have come to expect out of a responsive guitar like mine? And it's been a really interesting journey with it. And only in, I'll say, the recent year, do I really feel as though I have a grasp on it to where I can be a little more bold and take it even to the next step of what I have inside my head.
Great. So, first of all, for those who are listening to this who have no idea what the hell we're talking about, you have on some more recent designs of yours, and recent I said the last couple of years, but we don't see each other that often. We see each other maybe once a year, once every 2 years, so it seems like recent to me. And you're not using a traditional 4-inch sound hole on some of your models. You're doing something. Can you please describe for our listeners who haven't had the benefit of seeing what we're talking about yet? What do you call it? How do you describe it?
That's a good question.
Without a picture.
So I'm trying to reimagine a guitar. The silhouette of the instrument is still the same. I still build a 00 and OM and a modified dreadnought design. What's different is the porting of the instrument. We are very accustomed to seeing approximately 4-inch diameter sound hole on an acoustic steel string guitar. And what I'm doing is essentially taking that amount of air mass that can flow out of a 4-inch diameter sound hole and distributing it into multiple ports throughout the guitar, whether it's on the top or on the sides. And aesthetically speaking, I tend to call myself Mr. Linear. I'm not much for curved lines. Aesthetically, I like straight linear lines. And so I tend to build my ports in the shape of a cube or a square or a rectangle. And with that, my design sense kind of falls in line with a Paul Klee or Waisley Kandinsky style aesthetic. Other people notice that I'm also into architecture, and so a lot of my line values follow a more of a Frank Lloyd Wright style design. And most of my work in this field has gone in that direction over the last few years. And again, this is incorporated in both the soundboard of the instrument as well as the side of the instrument. And more so now than before, most of my porting is on the side of the guitar versus on the top of the guitar. And I do that for the purpose of honestly where most of my clientele or who most of my clientele are. And we're no longer in an era where we need an acoustic instrument to project to an audience 200 feet back in an auditorium. We are in a place where a lot of people play for themselves. A lot of people are in a studio recording. Um, and if you are, in fact, playing for an audience, mics are involved and the need to project isn't there anymore. And so what I'm doing for the player is adding more of the tone of the instrument for them. And it's one of the things I loved most about sound ports on a guitar is the player really gets to have a different experience with the instrument because of what they're able to hear and what they weren't able to hear before. So hopefully that's painting a bit of a picture.
Yeah,
I,
and aesthetically speaking, there's a lot more right angles that are happening as opposed to circles and ovals in your work. As far as the holes, the ports that we're talking about, and of course, if anybody wants to see these, they should absolutely go to your website, which is
it is krautguitars.com.
Kraut Guitars, KRAUT guitars.com. Correct?
Correct. And
Wonderful. Go check
also
it out while you're listening right now and loop you in.
and also, you know, I'm more of what I refer to as one of the reclusive builders. I don't get out very much. I like being sort of coddled away in my little workshop to myself. And because I've been doing this as long as I have, most people have played my guitars. I don't tend to go out to shows much anymore. However, now that I have gone into this new realm of building instruments, the one question I get asked the most is, do they sound like your other guitars? Do they sound like a traditional 4-inch diameter sound hole? And it doesn't really seem to matter how many times I tell somebody yes.
Yeah.
As they say, the proof's in the pudding. And so this year I'm going to be going to 2 shows to demonstrate 2 different, potentially 3 different models of this style of guitar so that people can hear it firsthand for themselves, that despite the more radical departure from a standard acoustic instrument, the tone can be exactly the same as what you would expect, just with an added visual excitement to it.
Yeah.
And so the first one I'll be going to is the Fretboard Summit this year, which is August 21st through 23rd. And then I'll be doing another show in Chicago. And then there is a show in Texas happening mid-month. I believe it's called the Big Show, BIG. And I'll be showing off the 2 to 3 instruments there as well. And I encourage anyone who's listening to this to come try it for themselves.
When is that show? The Big Show in Texas?
That would be September 12th through 14th.
Okay, great. So wonderful. And I can vouch for you that as far as anybody I can think of that's really experimenting with the sound holes and the placement of them, that I do think that your guitar has more of a traditional guitar sound, like, and I don't mean it sounds like a Martin or a Gibson, but it does sound like more like what guitars that have a 4-inch sound hole, the traditional spacing, than some of your contemporaries. You know, someone like Eric Wageshoff or Ben Wilburn, who are also changing where the sound hole placement is on the guitar. I think the sound of their guitars is a bigger departure from what someone thinks of as the fingerstyle acoustic guitar sound than what your guitar is. You know, would you agree with that? I don't know if you've played their guitars actually.
I have,
but I've spent quite a bit of time with them. Yeah.
I've played a lot of other people's guitars as well as the ones you've mentioned, and at the end of the day, I'm still what I call a Samaji boy. I'm trained by Irvin Samaji. I make responsive guitars, which in general, even in a standard form with a 4-inch diameter sound hole, is quite a departure from what people are accustomed to with steel string acoustic guitars. We build very lightly. We build responsively so that even a lightest touch of a string, the energy that's created there really brings out everything you can get out of a guitar body, out of that drum. And that's what's so important for me to express to people, is that even though I'm departing visually from what they're accustomed to seeing from me over the past couple decades, the tone is paramount to me still. And from day one, that was my whole goal. I want to be an artist, but at the same time, I'm here to build an acoustic guitar, and it's got to play right. It's got to sound right. And it's a real complex thing to talk to somebody who wants to order a guitar from you, who understands your reputation, and say, hey, I have this new idea for a guitar. I want you to wait 5 years on my wait list. I want you to experiment with me on this new design idea. And I'm really confident in what I'll be able to produce for you. And it's proved to be a really difficult thing. People want what they know, what's tried and true. Trying to get someone to pay a good amount of money for an instrument, but have it be, in their mind anyways, a risk, is a difficulty, which is why it's been a slow pursuit, but one I've been doing, where I'm slowly putting out these new guitars for the purpose, outside of my build list, that is, for the purpose for people to hear this for themselves. Know that you can still get a responsive guitar, a guitar that sounds incredible, even to a light touch player, but have a design like this. Because for me, especially at this point in my career, for a lot of reasons, it's important for me to finally be at a place where I can express what I want to out of my artwork.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So can we dive into this? Why does it work? And why did people say it wouldn't? What's the theory that told you that this wasn't going to work, and that you had to sort of do it 10 years later that and go, oh, why didn't I do this before? What and then how did maybe your understanding of that theory shift as a result of it?
Well, my background with Irvin is mostly in physics. It's how energy transfers into a top, how the bracing helps energize that top, and then the dipole action of the top, how it creates a pump and where the air volume goes thereafter. And by creating extra ports in the top, you're basically creating confusion inside of this drum. I've always looked at a guitar as a drum. That is a steel string acoustic guitar. And you got rigid sides. In my case, they're laminated like a drum. And you have two thin membranes on your top and back. And those membranes need to work together. There's an important dynamic between the two of those. And by way of creating different ports in a guitar, you're basically making that drum act differently. And in theory, that wasn't a good thing. We want to have the control and the projection of it in the way that is desired within the musical industry. And so for a long time, I never touched it, like I was saying before. I stayed away from it because I just had faith in the idea. And it made sense to me that if I cut a hole in the side of a guitar, that's going to make a difference. Regardless of what the difference is, it's going to do something. And I believed for a long time that that difference would be a negative aspect to the instrument, not a positive one. And to my surprise, approximately 10 years in, it wasn't a negative thing at all. In fact, it was a really positive thing. And at least to my ears, at least to what I could hear, and again, the way most people play guitars these days. And that led me into the idea of, okay, what can I get away with? What else can I do? And that had been percolating in my mind for years. But again, I do this for a living, and so I got to make money, and I build what people want from me. And so I was building the standard 4-inch diameter sound hole. I was adding more and more sound ports onto guitars. And eventually, through, I'll say, certain life situations with me, I just decided, I either got to do this or find some other way to express what I want to express in my artwork. Basically, I ran into a wall with it. And I mean, if I'm being honest with you, I'll say I was burned out. I was burned out of doing the traditional thing. I had a need that I was suppressing for a long time. And I decided, why not? Let's just do this and see what happens. And from that point is where I just slowly went about figuring out for myself what makes a difference and what doesn't. And one of the more interesting things that came out of this experimentation with me is I realized that if you make too small of a port in an instrument, like not enough porting, say smaller than a 4-inch diameter sound hole, that made an enormous difference in the sound and tone and the projection of my guitars. It was like a suffocating effect. And whereas if I went larger, say bigger than a 4-inch diameter sound hole, the effect was almost obsolete. There wasn't really much of a change at all. Not one that I could notice anyways. And so much so that I invited more people into my shop, people with ears that I respect, people who own guitar studio or music studios. And we did sound testing. We mic'd these things up. We put them through computer programs, noticing what differences there are. What happens if I cover a port and then release the cover from the port? And the effects were very minimal when it came to whether or not there was enough porting overall. The only effect that really came that was negative was if there wasn't enough porting in an instrument. My mentor once told me a story, or more like a metaphor, to trying to understand porting in a guitar. And I think it's one that most people can relate to if you're really trying to understand what sounds can change by way of porting. And he said to me one time over coffee, he would always take me, whenever there was a conversation to be had, he'd take me across the street to Cafe Pipo, and we'd have at least an hour-long talk of something. And in this case, he told me this metaphor of, imagine you're in Oakland, California, and you're in your car and you pull up next to someone at a stoplight. And this person next to you has got all the windows rolled up, but he or she is just blaring some music inside their car. You can hear him just having a good old time inside of their car. And then all of a sudden, this person starts to roll their window down. And in your mind, you can hear the way that starts to change. Those heavy basses and the muddled tone starts to clear up, and you get more of the treble responses, and it starts sounding more clear and balanced. And the more that window comes down, the more you have that balance and clarity. And when you think about it, when one of those windows is rolled down, at that point, you're hearing the music almost the same way that person in the car is hearing the music. And if they roll down a second window at that point, it doesn't really change that much. It's very subtle, because at that point, there's already porting coming through and you're hearing the music for what it is. It's not being muddled by there not being enough portage, if you will. And that was an interesting thought to me. And as I try to explain this to people moving forward with these designs, that seems to be the metaphor that gets through to people as a way of understanding how things change, like going from something that's too small of a circle and then opening it up. What effects does that have? And there's way more of effect by closing it up than there is by increasing it past a certain point. And it seems that at this point, at least within the context of my instruments, or a Samaji style responsive guitar, like the 4-inch diameter sound hole is, like, so to speak, where that window being rolled down is most optimal as far as not suffocating the instrument. And again, going beyond that, not as much of an effect. And at this point, I've talked so long, I fear maybe I've forgotten part of your question.
No, that's all right. So I wanted to know how, what that theory was, and if if you want, we can dive into that. And I don't know how much you like to be challenged. How much you like to test things back and forth. I can just nod and say or I can ask questions, and we can
I like challenges.
Because the biggest hole in that theory from Irvin in this scenario is the fact that all of the sound was originating inside that car, and that is not how a guitar works. That is not where the impetus of the sound is. That's where, once that top starts moving, then you get actual movement happening within the body of the guitar, but it actually starts on top of the guitar, outside of the car in that metaphor. And so that high end is never totally suffocated at all. As a matter of fact, you're not really hearing much of the high end coming out of that space. And so it's interesting. The metaphor is interesting, and it certainly is helpful to think about frequency response and where it comes from, and movement and time and perception. But yeah, we have to think about the whole system of a guitar. And I personally hear a lot of people giving the guitar and the air volume a little too much of the credit for what's going on with the complete system of a guitar. However, we can dive into that more later on if you'd like. But the rest of my question was, how did your experience change maybe your perception of that theory, and what changed at that point in time? And you explained that a little bit in your metaphor, that the porting, and that you said that more porting didn't necessarily make a big difference, but if you can get to a point where you have not enough porting and it just chokes it up. If I understood that correctly, would that be accurate from your
100%.
perspective?
And
Yeah.
and it's like what you were just saying. I do want to comment on it because, of
Mm-hmm.
course, you touch, tap anything, it makes a sound. So yes,
Mm-hmm.
there is, when you pluck a string or pick a string, there is a sound associated with that.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound really transfer to anything? It's really not much. It's like playing an electric guitar that's not amplified. Can you hear something? Yes, you can. Is it the tone of the instrument? No, it's just the tone of the string. And so when we're talking about the guitar in itself, yes, there's multiple aspects. We can talk about the density of a nut and saddle on a guitar. Does the neck joint make a difference? I mean, people go on and on about subtle details on an instrument that can make a difference in tone. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
from my experience, that's kind of getting into the minutia. It's sort of like the 1-2% of what an instrument is, not the majority of what an instrument is. And in this case, when it comes to a steel string guitar and the way that I've been taught to build a guitar, the body is everything. The projection is everything. The pump and what happens to that energy that's created by plucking the string, that's everything. And it gets into what I was saying earlier too about, where does theory match up with reality? Like, what makes a difference and what doesn't? Because that's all I'm interested in anymore. I don't care about the theory or what people have done study wise. I care about what makes a difference in my guitars
Mm-hmm.
and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And that treble absolutely goes away completely with a porting on a guitar that isn't big enough.
Mm-hmm.
It and I know this because the very first one of these I made had that.
Mm-hmm.
I came up with a beautiful design, and I was curious to see if that was enough. And the truth was, it wasn't. Not to me, anyways. To me, it was suffocated. So I had to make
Mm-hmm.
amendments to that instrument in order to get enough porting into it and to bring the tone in the way I wanted it to.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, when you pluck the string, it makes a sound. But when you're playing a responsive guitar,
Mm-hmm.
and I can get into what I mean by a responsive guitar here in a minute,
Mm-hmm.
it's more about what happens in that pump, because that's essentially what we're making. One of my favorite things to do with people when they're visiting my shop, or if I'm at a show and they want to understand more about a responsive guitar, is I'll tell people to put their hands over the port, any
Mm-hmm.
port, doesn't matter which one, and then just pluck a string. Because on a responsive guitar, you feel air coming out of this guitar body. You feel it acting as a pump. And that's what we're creating, is a pump. And hopefully through what we've learned in guitar building, we're making it a pleasurable sound in the process. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we're able to, during the voicing of the instrument, make it do what we want it to do to have the sound that we want.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's a massive difference when you start shrinking that port size to making versus making a bigger port. That's what I'm getting
Yeah.
to with all of this, is even though there are, in my opinion, like the 1-3% differences, yes, you can hear things from just plucking a string.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the major part of an instrument that I build that makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
If that answers.
Yeah. Well, it does. It tells me what you're thinking. Um, Although I would still say that, when you build a speaker box,
Mm-hmm.
you don't stand and listen at the port. You stand and listen at the front of the speaker cone. And the porting does affect it. It affects slow frequency. It affects the air movement. It makes the air movement inefficient, and it comes out at a lower frequency, which we hear as a bass response by the time we translate it through our eardrums. However, most of the sound is coming off the speaker cone itself, which in the guitar is the top itself. And so there's a lot of movement that's happening outside of the box, not just in the box. And when you close that hole up too much, you actually create a vacuum and you create a negative pressure response, which stifles the top. But that does not mean that all the sound is coming out of the hole. It just means that you stop the amplitude because you have a negative resistance happening at that point in time. And so if we're going to use a drum, if we're going to use a speaker as an example, we still stand in front of that. And when we mic a drum, we mic the drum head, not the port, and we don't mic the resonant head. In drum theory, I'm a drummer as well. In drum theory, we use the top to tune the pitch, and we use the back to create the sustain or decay. If we loosen the head, you have very little sustain, a quick decay, boom. If we crank up the head, we can have a crazy amount of sustain, right? And if we want it to go doom, which is the modern pop drum sound, we find that balance in that tension point. That's really how much resistance it is. So to me, when thinking about acoustic theory at all, and if we're going to talk about the acoustic guitar, it's a matter of making obstacles or affordances to guide the energy to the part of the system you want, or keep it from the system where you don't want it in that case. And so we want a certain amount of that, of the air volume, which is really still molecules. We're talking about, at that point in time, gases, moving at a certain frequency. And by closing up that aperture, you can actually lower the fundamental pitch of the guitar by doing so. You open it up and the fundamental pitch will go up, because when you open it up, the air escapes easier. When you close it up, it is retained longer and it slows it down at that point in time. And that comes out less frequently, low frequency by the time it hits our eardrum. And so I think that the things you're talking about are absolutely true. But I think there's more giving a little bit too much to just the air volume, that I think that porting is very important when we port a speaker as well. But that actually the primary sound is still being pushed physically by the amplitude of the top moving up and down on the outside, not just what's happening with air volume.
I would agree with that 100%. To me, this gets more into, how we're voicing the top and creating the sound instrument that we want to do in the first place. You're right. It's not just about the porting. I'm only describing the porting as something I noticed make a big difference in the new designs that I'm doing. The voicing of the guitar is still happening the same. How I want that top to respond to the energy that it's given, that hasn't changed through me departing into a different world, aesthetically speaking. And so there are 2,553 things that go on to making a top move the way that it does. And that has more to do with the sound of the instrument, 100%, than the porting does. But they have to work together. And so just talking about this from an aesthetic point of view and what I'm doing, this has been the major thing that I've had to work around as far as how to keep my guitar sounding the same. From one design to the next, because nobody's seen what I'm doing right now with the two guitars the two specific guitars that I'm taking to these shows this year. And they're a lot different than anything I've done in the past. But again, I am on a slow movement over into seeing what I can get away with, aesthetically speaking, and still maintain that same sound. And there's a problem with me, and at least the way that my brain works, about just going full bore right away. Because then if something's different, I don't know if it was A, B, C through Z that I did different. And so each one of these that I've done, I've incorporated something different on that I've been able to pay attention to and see whether or not that's of value or not.
Control test that you can quantify.
Exactly.
And I will again restate that you've done, from my experience, an excellent job in that. Because although I like the sound of a Skytop guitar from Eric Wagenshoff or Ben Wilburn's guitars, Eric's guitars do not sound like a more traditional guitar. They have a very distinctly different sound. And so I understand you saying you want your guitars to sound as a Kraut guitar has sounded, while being able to make some physical modifications to do a different aesthetic. And I think, honestly, you're doing an excellent job doing so. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I look forward to seeing these next mystery guitars you're talking
We're
about.
all biased when it comes to tone. And, I don't believe in there being, to a certain extent anyways, right or wrong when it comes to the sound of an instrument. I, in fact, love the variety that exists out in the world of what people are doing. And I myself don't believe in any one thing. I like variety. I like change. I like shift. But within the context of what I build, I think it's important for every builder to find the tone that inspires them, whoever that builder is, and be consistent with it. To me, that's the sign of a good builder, is consistency in tone, regardless of whatever alterations you do to an instrument. It's the consistency that I believe really brings somebody to a particular maker. Whether you want that Olsen tone or a Samaji tone or a Trauger tone, a Kraut tone, a Matsuda, a Wilborn, we're all different and unique in ways that we build. And it's part of what makes this industry so utterly complex. People have a tendency to really gravitate towards certain wood combinations. Well, those wood combinations, it's not as simple as saying I like Sitka tops and rosewood back and sides of any variety, because within the context of whatever builder is using them, they can come out sounding completely different. Most people don't, in my experience, a lot of people don't like maple guitars. But when people play my guitars out, I love maple. And when people play my guitars out of maple, they have this weird experience where they're like, wow, I've never played a maple guitar that I've liked before, but this is completely different. And it's really because every builder can do something different with the type of wood. It's all in how you build with it. It's how you voice the guitar. It's the stiffness to weight ratios in a particular piece, there's so many variables inside of an acoustic guitar. But again, for me, the importance always comes down to, what do you like? Stick with what you like. That's important as a builder. Be who you are, through tone, through playability, through how a guitar is supposed to feel to you. And then people come to you for that. And so consistency to me is really what makes a good luthier, a good builder. But
consistency, and as you just said, you're not being you're the master of the material, not the other way around. And someone said, as you said, someone says, I don't like maple guitars. Like, well, maybe you don't like what you've seen of a maple guitar, but it's a lot more to do with what I do with that material than it is to do with the material properties themselves. Now, don't get me wrong. We can take that only so far. I can't build a guitar out of a rock and a piece of paper, but
right. There are limits.
There are limits. There are limits. But, a couple of years ago, I did a symposium at the Venice Biennale of Architecture with an architect from New York, Ed Keller. And two of the topics that we discussed have already come up in this interview with you. And that was, we dealt with one as the materiality of sound was a primary thing we wanted to talk about. And part of that was the fact that, as we just described, Irvin has a theory about how the guitar works. You learned something a little bit different. And what I noticed, because I talk with many hundreds, maybe thousands, definitely hundreds of guitar makers around the world, and usually the ones who are doing something quite different and who have mastered a particular set of skills, that regardless, every guitar maker has a different theory on how it works. And then beyond that, I would speak to a mechanical engineer or a physicist or an architect or an acoustician. And again, they would use a different language set when we talked about it. So at this symposium at the Venice Biennale, we brought together acousticians, instrument makers, architects, physicists, neuroscientists, to talk about materiality, to the physicality of how we receive it and perceive it, to see if we could agree on a common set of terms to develop a lexicon where we can talk about materiality and sound. Uh, and and I had a number of people in that symposium who, are acousticians within architecture who are like, let's stop calling these acoustic materials. All materials are acoustic materials. It's about how we use them. It's about how we engage with them. And complexity of a hard material is just as effective as for absorbing sound than a piece of soft material can be.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a matter of how we treat it. And he did an installation piece where they took automotive glass in these sort of hexagonal shapes, and they put it in a kiln and they sagged it at different directions and put certain slits into it. And they had determined ahead of time what should work. And they made automotive glass, which is normally considered an absolutely awful acoustic material. They took it and they went across with a microphone, the way they test sound and reverberancy. And they had it where it was reflective. They had it where it was diffusive, and they had it where it was absorptive. Automotive glass, absorbing sound, reflecting or diffusing. Same material. It's a matter of how we shape it. And that's where true mastery comes from. And so you being able to make a maple guitar that someone else goes, oh, wow, this is the first maple guitar that I really like, shows a mastery of materials and method. And so that to me is true mastery. Not telling me that if you want a bassy guitar, get a rosewood guitar. If you want a guitar with more mid-range, get a mahogany guitar. That's BS. Sorry. That's reproducing someone else's ideas, but it's not true mastery.
Well, I can't tell you how exciting it is to hear you say what you just said. It warms my heart. I've known this for a long time, and I feel like I run into walls with this on a regular basis, trying to tell people about woods and energy and how things work within the context of how I build a guitar. And people seem to struggle with it. And I think they struggle with it from multiple aspects, but just understanding that another piece of wood like a maple can sound like a great guitar, even though you've had experiences in your past where they don't sound good, regardless of who the maker is or how it was made, doesn't mean that maple's a bad sounding guitar. It's just absolutely not. It is 100% what a builder does with the wood that makes it what it is. And yeah, if you go out and play factory guitars, which build by numbers, I'm sure you've heard plenty of guitars that sound bad out of every different type of wood. But in the right hands of someone who knows what they're doing, any wood that I've come across can really be an exceptional tone wood. It's just about how you handle it and work with it to bring out its potential. And it really warms my heart to hear how you just described this in this symposium that you were at. I love alternative tone woods. We are in an industry that is just enriched in tradition in lots of different aspects, mostly in the classical world and of instrument building, more so than the steel string world. We seem to have more slack in our particular instrument that other makers have. And I really love bringing out new tone woods, but I run into walls with people again, sort of like the designs on a guitar. When I try to explain to somebody this idea that I have, whether, visually speaking, it's really hard to get that across to someone who really doesn't see what I see and hear what I hear and understand what I understand. And the same goes into tone woods. And I used to have these experiences pretty regularly where I would build a guitar outside my build list, typically one a year. And I would use an alternative tone wood because I would have these things in my, wood storage for many, many years because I can't convince somebody to use it. People want to stick with something traditional, something they've known, something they've liked in the past. They're not interested in experimentation and trying something new. Doesn't matter how much I tell a person how this really is what it is. And so I started just building this one guitar a year outside of my build list out of different woods. And the very first one I did was actually maple. It was a European maple. And what would happen is I build this instrument, and then generally the next one or two people that would call me looking for an instrument, I'd let them know, hey, I got this guitar in the works. And almost every single time they'd be like, I don't really like that wood, or I've never played that before, and I'm not really going to want it. And I'll say to them, okay, here's what I want to do. Let me send you this guitar when it's done. And if you don't like it, doesn't cost you any money, I'll cover the shipping costs and just send it right back to me. Not one of the guitars I ever did that to, which was at least 7 of them at this point, not one of them came back to me, because people got to hear it for themselves in person. My favorite one to date was a wood called Kiyaki, which is a common Japanese wood. You rarely see it outside of the country. And I had just stumbled into this wood. I was still living up in Oregon at the time. And a friend of mine happened to have had some other wood, and he invited me over to take a look at what he had. And that happened to have been, at that particular time, pale moon ebony, which nobody was building with back then. And he had this particularly beautiful billet of it that came in. And it's funny, I get there, and even though the aesthetics of that pale moon ebony is extraordinary, it's really beautiful, it's very busy. And I happen to look around in his shop, and I see, what most people, including myself, would refer to as the most boring looking piece of wood in the world. It was perfectly quarter sawn, straight grained, a bit of a yellowish hue to it. It just looked like a straight grain piece of wood. Nothing exciting about it whatsoever. But I picked this piece of wood up, and it's lightweight. And you could just rub your fingers on this wood and hear what it wants to do. And I'm like, wow, this is one of the most extraordinary tone woods I've ever come across. I've never even heard of it before. And he tells me about it, and I look it up, and I couldn't find any other guitars built out of it at the time, except for maybe a couple people in Japan, Japanese luthiers that were working with it. But in America and in Europe, I couldn't find it anywhere. And again, went through probably 6 years of having this piece of wood sitting in my shop with me salivating in my mouth, just excited to work with this piece. But I can't talk anybody into it because nobody's heard of it. Nobody knows what it is. And you can't get people to take the chance on it. Until one day, once again, I just say, okay, this is my guitar this year. I made a double O out of it. And it blew me out of the water. And sure enough, somebody calls me up, within a week or so of me getting this guitar back from my finisher. And I convince him to try out the guitar. And he tries it, and he was so convinced he wasn't going to like this instrument. And he gets this thing in his hands, and all he could say was benevolent things about the guitar. And of course, he ends up keeping it. So anyways, the point of that long rant is just to say that almost anything can be a great tone wood for an instrument. Most woods can be a great tone wood for an instrument. Going to these shows this year, I'm bringing a new tone wood that nobody's tried before, that I've actually introduced into the market, which just so happens to, conveniently because this wood comes from where I'm living at the time, but it's desert ironwood. And it's, to my knowledge, never been made into an instrument before. Generally speaking, the trees are very small, but just so happens where my property is located, I had some giant dead ironwoods that have been on the property. And I've been able to mill this up successfully into guitar sets. And I'll be bringing 2 of these instruments. It's part of these sort of secret instruments that I'm bringing to the shows this year. But it's going to be made out of this desert ironwood. So I'm particularly excited to get to these shows because for 2 parts. One, I'm bringing guitars, aesthetically speaking, that are very unique and different from what people have ever seen before. But I'm also bringing a new tone wood that people haven't really had the ability to get and use.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fun on all counts for me.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world. Where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive, those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Jamie Gale Music. We are better together, so let's do this together. I love where we've been, and I'm excited about where we're going. This space is normally reserved for brands who make stories like this possible, like the Dario and the Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop. If your company belongs in this conversation, let's talk. We partner with brands who value craft, culture, and the quiet power of a well-placed idea. Great. So, ironwood, one of the things to note about woods is that how woods get named, at least in English anyways, I have no idea, because there are certain names that you can find across multiple continents which have almost nothing to do with each other, but the only ironwood that I've come in contact with has been exceedingly heavy and exceedingly dense. And does this match that same description? Is it exceedingly heavy and exceedingly dense, like a piece of iron, this wood, or is it somehow different?
Yes and no. And so what I've realized ever since talking about ironwood in the Luthiery industry is that there are a lot of woods around the world that people refer to commonly as ironwood.
Mm-hmm.
But there is only one desert ironwood. It is the only one within its species even. And it only comes from the Sonoran Desert.
Mm-hmm.
And the name implies that this wood would be extremely dense and extremely heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And even myself thought that that would be the case. And when I originally had to remove these dead trees from my property to build my house, it didn't even occur to me to use this as a tone wood, because especially as coming down as a log, of course it's heavy. and I don't particularly like heavy instruments, just from my own bias. And so I never really even considered it to be used in this way. To my surprise, the wood itself is extremely beautiful, and it looks a lot like a rosewood. And I started cutting it up to use for other projects, because I'm not just a luthier. I'm a woodworker in general. I love building anything and everything, whether it's a house that I did build myself, my shops, which I built myself. I got my start in woodworking on the lathe when I was 13 years old. I build everything and I love it all. And so I started just cutting this up for random purposes. But when I started having smaller pieces of it, it's innate within a luthier to, when feeling a piece of wood, it just kind of clicks like what you could use this for. Or I know the weight of an ebony bridge, for example, versus a rosewood bridge versus an African blackwood piece of whatever it happens to be. And I'm sitting here holding this piece of ironwood going, that's a lot lighter than I was expecting it to be. And so I did an interesting test. I ended up making a bridge out of Honduran rosewood, Brazilian rosewood, ebony, Gaboon ebony, and ironwood, and a couple different pieces of ironwood, because they are drastically different based on the age of the tree, and mostly in aesthetic, not so much in weight. And I weighed them all, and it wasn't, again, what I had expected at all. When you think of ironwood, you think of a wood that they say will sink in water when you
Mm-hmm.
put it in water.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously that makes you think that it's going to be pretty extraordinarily heavy,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't. African blackwood came in at about twice the weight.
Mm-hmm.
It weighs less than gaboon ebony, but it weighs more than rosewood. And so
Mm-hmm.
it comes in at kind of a nice balance in between the two. And so,
Okay.
especially
Mm-hmm.
for finding something that's big enough to make back and sides out of an instrument, I'm just over the
Yeah.
moon about it. And it is, of course, tonal. And I say, of
Yeah.
course, because just from my own experience, typically when a wood is dense like that,
Mm-hmm.
it tends to be very energetic. And especially if the wood is also brittle.
Mm-hmm.
And this wood is both of those things.
What do you
And
mean by energetic? Why is it? Tell me why you say it's energetic.
well, it's about the way, again, there's scientific ways of looking at this stuff, and then there's more, what's the word I'm looking for here? Like an internal just understanding, like a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like when I was talking about earlier with the kiyaki, I touch the wood and I'm just moving it within my fingertips, and I
Yeah.
can feel and hear the energy inside of that wood.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty innate in someone like me. And
Yeah.
mostly
That's a empirical knowledge built on multiple experiences. It's
yeah,
not a scientific
mostly
thing. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
mostly from how I was taught. And it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
that way before, but when I spent time with Irvin, for
Mm-hmm.
example, the way he taught me to process a soundboard, a top for an acoustic guitar, there were
Mm-hmm.
no measuring tools, there were no nothing. When it came time to thicknessing tops, because I'm in
Mm-hmm.
his shop, we were making a lot of guitars back then. I think we were processing probably a 12 to 17 ish tops. And we're
Mm-hmm.
sending them all through this thickness sander. And every time it came out, he had me on the backside of the machine, and I'd pick up the piece of wood as it came through, and I'd just feel it in my hands. I'd feel the weight of it. I'd flex it with the grain. I'd flex it across the grain. I'd notice he wanted me to feel and notice everything that changes, even with the reduction of just a couple thousandths of an inch, and
Mm-hmm.
what that does to a board. And through experience, count on 20 years since then, it really becomes a thing that's innate in you, where you really feel and notice most aspects of what a wood has to offer just by having it in your hands.
Mm-hmm.
I know that probably sounds weird to a lot of people, but it's true.
Yeah.
And and so when I pick up a piece of ironwood, or if I pick up any piece of wood, I do it unconsciously. It's just there. It registers in my head. That's why when I was holding that piece of wood, immediately I was thinking to myself, wow, I wasn't picking it up for the purposes of seeing how much it weighed. It just came to me intuitively like, wow, this is
Mm-hmm.
not heavy as I had thought it would be. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what made me end up doing some tests to see what the weight actually was in comparison to other materials that people commonly use, in this case, for making a bridge on an acoustic guitar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, when I feel the wood, it was telling me that this has acoustic properties. This would make an acoustic guitar.
Mm-hmm.
And I could tell that from the way it felt within my fingers, the way I was moving with it, the sound that it was making when I did that.
Mm-hmm.
And the brittleness part of it, like typically speaking, and I have another story of this, of a guitar that I'm building right now. When
Mm-hmm.
woods tend to be brittle, like they crack a lot, Brazilian rosewood is a
Mm-hmm.
great example of it. It's very brittle, it cracks all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It tends to be a better source of energy to transfer through and move the way that we want it to move in the context of a guitar. I can't get into the science behind all of that. I just know it
Mm-hmm.
through experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's why so many people love woods like Brazilian rosewood. I mean, there's lots of reasons
Mm-hmm.
why people like that wood, but mostly it's because it does make great instruments, not just acoustic guitars, but it makes lots of great instruments. And getting back to the ironwood, I felt that same thing within this wood. And
Mm-hmm.
what this wood has going for it is it's very unique in that it's incredibly old. And
Mm-hmm.
ironwood trees are different than most trees that I've ever, and not just most trees, any other tree that I've ever learned about or have knowledge of. So much so that trees like this can be grafted back together and dead trees can even come back to life, which to me is pretty extraordinary. The wood that I'm using right now, according to the University of Arizona, which is carbon dating the wood for us, uh, it appears to have been 4 different lives of a tree. And it's complicated even to carbon date because of that, apparently. And it's been a long process, and they've had to take multiple samples of different parts of the tree to understand how old each section is, because of course one tree can be older than the next. And on top of it, it's naturally protected within the context of when it dies, as in bugs don't like to go into it. There's natural like insecticides like in the wood. Termites won't even eat it. And it takes up to 1900 years for a tree to decompose in the wild after it's dead. So dating a tree like this is kind of complicated. And to me, it's also incredibly fascinating that a tree can be dead for up to 1900 years and not decompose. And now imagine a piece of wood that has been dead in the Sonoran Desert for, let's just say, 100 years. And through the course of that 100 years, it's being cooked in the sun every day during the summer, relentlessly for months on end. And cooking a piece of wood like that changes the molecular makeup of the wood itself. It's sort of like these days, it's fairly popular for people to torrefy a piece of wood, like baking tops in the oven in order to change the makeup of it. Essentially, what that means to me is you're making the top more brittle, because that is what happens to it. They become more brittle. They're dried out. They're more brittle. To me, again, that comes down to it being more responsive. I touch that piece of wood and I can just hear the energy wanting to come out of it. And so now, faster response. So now, looking at it from this ironwood, it's been cooked outside for all of these years, for anywhere from 100 to 1900 years. Imagine what that was like for someone like me to get that in my hands and start feeling it all of a sudden. Like, wow, this is interesting stuff. And that's what's prompted me to make instruments out of it. And so I'll be bringing the first 2 guitars, at least that I know of, that have ever been made out of desert ironwood to these 2 shows this year, which I'm quite excited about.
Yeah. I look forward to experiencing those instruments, hopefully, in a few months.
Will you be at the show? Will you be at the Fretboard Summit?
Yeah, I should be there. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So I hope I'll see them there.
Well, I look forward to hearing what you have to say about them.
Yeah. So I have something to say about the energy that we're talking about. And I think that everything what you're saying is true about the quickness of the response. But many people think about it in the opposite direction, and that those woods are not so great because of how they move. They're so great because of how they don't move. They're an obstacle to energy. And so in the system of the guitar, the energy stays within the top of the guitar longer because it's an inefficient transfer to that, because they're an obstacle. And therefore you get greater amplitude out of the top with the same given amount of energy. When you reduce the stiffness of your sides, let's use a common example. When we go from rosewood to mahogany, let's say, people commonly say that rosewood has more bass response. Mahogany has more of a mid-range, faster attack. But it's not because the mahogany has more mid-range. Actually, it has less. It has a lower tap tone. The rosewood has a higher tap tone. It has a higher pitch, not lower pitch. But what it does do is, because of its stiffness, is that when we start the kinetic movement of the strings, which moves into the top via the bridge and the nut at that point in time, the saddle, and it begins to move, the energy wants to move out indefinitely, right? And it's retained within the top because of the obstacle of the back and sides, which are a more dense material. And so when we have a very dense material, especially a dense material with a laminated or constructed sides, which becomes more stiff, becomes more of an obstacle, that given amount of energy stays longer within the top, which creates a greater amplitude. That amplitude means the top travels further, and it takes more time for it to reach its peaks, which we perceive then as a lower frequency or a fuller sound because it has more time within them, low frequency. When we change those back and sides to something like a mahogany, for a common example, let's say, or a maple, we'll say, oh, it has more tack, but it has less bottom end. Mm-hmm. That's because the energy actually leaves the top faster and starts to get distributed into the rest of the guitar. It moves into the mahogany or the maple out of the top. And so the top actually doesn't travel as far because the energy is no longer just in the top, it's moved out of the top faster. And so you have less amplitude. And we perceive that because there's less time between the peaks of the top and the bottom as mid-range or mid-frequency versus low frequency. And so although the ultimate effect in the system is that we get more low frequency when we use these very dense woods, it's not because the wood is is producing the low frequency. It's because it's a greater obstacle and the top has more low frequency because it travels further with more amplitude.
So you're getting into something really exciting and incredibly complex, because what you say, I agree with. Mm-hmm. However, if you were to take me along with 12 other different luthiers and have us build what we build out of these said woods, every one of these guitars would sound different. And it's not just because of the material choices. It's because of how we brace the guitars, the materials of which we use to brace the guitar. How do we voice the guitar? What's the stiffness rating of your top? What's the stiffness rating of your back? What type of sides are you using? You know, what kind of neck projection are you got with your neck angle? How tall is your saddle? What's the break angle off the back of your saddle? It's never as simple as saying any one thing causes a guitar to change. It is an unfathomable amount of differences. And when it comes to dense woods, again, you heard me earlier talk about, you know, building guitars by numbers when I was talking about a factory, because that's how they're forced to build instruments in the scale of which they build them.
Yeah. On averages, they still know something about the materials, but they have to do it on an average as opposed to individual pieces. Yes.
Exactly right. Yeah. And that's largely what sets luthiers apart from factories is we don't build by numbers. And this doesn't equate to all of us, by the way, but I'll speak for myself. I don't build by numbers. I build by stiffness ratings. And so my backs don't rarely come out at the same thickness every time. I give you that example earlier about how Irvin had me sand tops and feel the differences. We don't sit there with a set of calipers measuring out our tops. We go for deflection ratings. And there's some people who set up deflection devices with dial calipers in order to set amounts of weight to get those things. And there's those of us who just have it by feel. That's what we're accustomed to. No right or wrong. It's just what we do. And so when it comes to a wood that's more dense and has that characteristic to it, where it's very brittle, it's responsive. For me, it's not that big of it doesn't change that much of what the instrument is. It doesn't change the way that my tops act into it, because I work with that piece of wood to get it to where I want it to be. And again, this is where it gets complicated within the context of deciding what part of a guitar makes a big difference, because we all do things so much differently. And I can only speak for myself and what I learned from my mentor about how we were building guitars, at least how he was building guitars 20 years ago, that when it comes to wood like this, whether it's maple, whether it's a mahogany that's soft, whether it's koa, that to me is sort of in the middle, or whether you were talking African blackwood or Brazilian rosewood, or in this case, desert ironwood. All of these woods get dealt with differently in order to make them work within the context of what I want out of the instrument. And so a dense wood like this that, as you say, doesn't move as much. Again, what you say, I completely agree with. In the reality of what ends up coming out of my guitars and how I end up working with it to get it to move the way that I want it to, it doesn't end up translating into the difference in which we can apply theory to. So for me, anyways, it's an extraordinary tone wood. I like a really dense wood. I like a really brittle wood. Right now, Roberta Venn is beginning to celebrate their 50th year anniversary. And they have selected, I believe, 50 of their students from the past to celebrate the 50th year anniversary by all of us building guitars made out of wood that John Roberts brought in decades ago. And this wood that he brought in had been sitting outside in Phoenix for decades. And it's prone to checking, cracking. It's incredibly brittle. It went through that same cycle I was telling you that ironwood was doing out in the wild by itself. Hot, dry, wet, back and forth for decades. And so recently they milled up all this wood and they sent it out to all the different luthiers that are doing this project with Roberta Venn. And I ended up making a short video with this wood because of how brittle it is. And different, one particular way that I treat this wood when I get it in. How do I make this into a guitar when it's so prone to cracking? And how I haven't recorded the video yet, how I turn this into a guitar, but just how I'm treating this piece of wood. And because it really is an extraordinary tone wood. This happens to be Nicaraguan rosewood. But you touch this thing and it wants to crack. So we ended up, essentially casting it almost, but filling the pores and the microfractures in the wood with glue, pressurizing it in there to ensure that it goes into this piece of wood. And all of that to say, like, it doesn't turn it into a bad. And to me, everything, it's worth dealing with what I have to go through to stabilize this wood, because for me personally, it ends up making an extraordinary instrument, tonally speaking. So for it being hard and dense, to me, in the way that I build my guitars, is actually a benefit. It's not a con, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I've seen that wood, by the way. We took the Boutique Guitar Showcase tour to Roberta Venn in 2023, and they were showing me those piles of wood back there in the, I mean, still in the desert sun. Like, they're not really protected. They weren't.
Oh, no. They were outside for decades, and you saw it in their new location, their old location in the old Quonset hut they had. It was, I mean, that stuff was out in the sun, uncovered, being baked for decades.
But there are some interesting techniques, like what you're talking about. We did an Art Basel Miami Art Week show back, I don't remember when now, 2018, 2019, something of the sort. And Randy Parsons, a fantastic electric guitar maker, does a lot of very entertaining works, let's say. And Randy made a necromancy Telecaster where he had taken extremely spalted maple and injected it in a similar way you're talking about, in cactus juice in like a high pressure vacuum system to sort of stabilize that wood again and take basically what was rotting wood in that case and turn it back into something stable enough to create a guitar out of. And it was it's amazing what we can do with materials if we have the will to do so and the patience to figure it out.
And again, going back to the symposium you went to, using auto glass and how you can manipulate a thing in such a way to make it do what you need it to do. And so really, even using a piece like spalted maple, there's no reason in the world that can't be an effective back and sides to an instrument. It's just a matter of what you're capable and willing to do to make it so. And in his case, using cactus juice, that's a popular stabilization glue or resin, really, for people. And
sounds like voodoo witchcraft, but it's a real thing. Cactus juice.
It's a real thing. I haven't personally used it, but I've heard about it, and it if it works, it works.
Yeah. And for those who are interested in diving a little deeper on the physics side of things, Zachary Bellinger is the acoustician and architect that I'm talking about. It's one of our earliest podcasts, but if you go to if you go to jamiegale.net and look at Life with Strings Attached there, or on YouTube, or just look back wherever you're listening right now, Zachary Bellinger, Acoustic and Architecture, we talked about this. I also talked about some of the theories that we were discussing there with Lamborghini's aerospace engineer, Giulio Di Donato. I was really testing these ideas of physics with a number of people in the last 2 years to try and properly understand physics as it relates to sound. And so there's a few of the podcasts that I should probably group on the website to say, if you want to look at physics of instruments and materials, listen to these 3 or 4 of the podcasts. But Giulio Di Donato, and also we have, oh my God, I can't believe I forget his name. So sorry, Tom. I know your first name. He's D'Addario's acoustic engineer, and he was on the show with us as well. Tom Nania. You can look up him also and listen to those podcasts. And so, Ray, I look forward to diving deeper into some of those discussions with you at another point where I have the benefit of something to write on a whiteboard, and we can test some theories back and forth and get real geeky on those things.
In general, I love diving into the geeky thing of stuff. I admit these days, I understand my mentor more than I did 20 years ago when I was studying with him. When I watched him voice a guitar, it was almost like a spiritual thing for him. He wouldn't talk to me. He would just sit there and just kind of embrace what he was doing. And I would sit there quietly and watch and ask questions later. And I've learned a lot of the things that he does are that way. Because even though Irvin is uniquely talented at talking physics and most things on, a level most of us probably wouldn't understand. And there's another side of him that is very instinctual and all about touching and feeling. And that was a big takeaway for me personally. And it's a hard thing for me to describe to somebody what that's like, whether you're voicing an instrument and you're carving a piece of wood, and the instinctual understanding of, rather than diving into the cube rule of stiffness when cutting down a brace, but just the instinctual understanding of what you're going to do if you take another 32nd of an inch off that brace. There really is 2 different schools of how to understand those things, from a more instinctual level to a physics level. And like Irvin, I enjoy them both. But I, like him, these days, having an understanding of the physics idea of how a guitar top is moving and what changes that. But to have that understanding sort of in the subconscious of your head, and then attack it from more of a tactile way, almost a spiritual way. It's a real thing. And I really enjoy it. In fact, I'll say I love it. And those have become some of my favorite days in the shop. Most days are my favorite days in the shop because it's where I want to be. But those particular days, there's something about them. I believe there's a term for what happens. I think it's a bit of a dopamine hit when you end up getting goosebumps on your arms because something just comes over you and you're doing something very unique. And it's kind of like that. Imagine getting into a thing, you're voicing or you're thicknessing a top, and you just get goosebumps because you can feel how all of a sudden 1/1000th of an inch off of a top just really allowed it to move in the way that I wanted it to. Such a small difference. So the physics side of thing is really fun. But to me these days, I'm more excited and thrilled by the idea of tactile approaches to things and just that instinctual
Yeah.
intuitiveness.
I like the tactile side of things too, and I agree with what you're saying. Um, as a matter of fact, I have a very similar approach to musical instruments in the way of I don't need to play a guitar or even hold it in my hands to know probably about 95% of everything I need to know about that guitar. I will approach a guitar that's hanging on a wall or in a stand, and I'll pluck the A string with my thumb while leaving my fingers just sort of in the pocket of the neck on the treble side. And I'll
Mm-hmm.
feel that guitar move. And that will tell me almost everything I need to know about how that instrument sounds, how it responds, because that's the same thing, actually. It's perception, whether you're feeling it through your fingers or whether you're hearing it with your eardrums. And so I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure I can agree with you that it's instinctual, though. Do you really think it's instinct, or it's accumulated experience that you
Perhaps
can
that's a better
you
way
know
of
what's happening with the sensory response?
that's a better way of saying it, because it is through experience.
Yeah.
It's again, it's like it comes from the subconscious. Another
Mm-hmm.
example of what I mean by this is, I used to be an obsessive guitar player.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason I became a guitar builder was because I broke my left hand. I crushed a couple knuckles in my left hand,
Mm-hmm.
which after years of trying to get through it and not fusing my fingers together and dealing with a lot of pain, I realized, okay, I can't do this anymore. I can't do it professionally anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of what led me into becoming a guitar builder. And
Mm-hmm.
because I wasn't interested in having cortisone shots in my hand every 3 months, I put the guitar down for a significant amount of time. I'll say about 5 years. And it's not that I didn't pick it up and pluck it when I was, building a guitar and stringing it up and setting up action. Of course I did. But I didn't sit down and really play it. And from that moment, let's just say for the sake of argument, it was 5 years. 5 years later, I'm really missing it. And I just want to have a day off, which I didn't have the luxury of when I first started my business. But I just took a day for myself and I just sat down and played guitar. And an interesting thing occurred where previous to this, I was all into theory. I had every book that had every scale on earth, and I was going to school for it, and I was obsessed with the theory. But over the course of those 5 years, I was so distracted by doing something else that what happened when I picked up that guitar is that theory was still in the back of my head, but it wasn't in the forefront of my head. It was almost as though I forgot so much of it that I played in a completely different way. I was playing what I was referring to before as instinctually. And again, perhaps a better way of saying that is I'm playing from experience, but I wasn't trapped in this idea of this construct. It was more open because literally I had forgotten all of my lessons. And so when I sat down to play, I found it really interesting and exciting because I was playing in a way I'd never played before. All those traps I was in, or the easy places to go to because I remembered where I could go to make something work musically, all of that stuff was gone. And it was almost like I started anew. And that's kind of what I mean by this. It's not to say that any of that early stuff wasn't important. In fact, it was extremely important for me, whether it was guitar playing or guitar building. But taking this new approach of this collective amount of experience, still having all the understanding in the subconscious of the brain, just working it in this sort of unhinged way, it's really exciting, and it feels really good. It felt really good when I played guitar like that. It felt better than what it did when I put it down, and not just because my hand was in a lot of pain back then, but because it felt more authentic. It felt more myself, and sort of like the designs I'm doing now. It feels more me. I'm bringing with it all the experience I've had over the past couple of decades. Everything I know about guitar building is still going into this. The sound is still coming out the same. But what I get out of it is more authentically who I am as a person without restrictions. And moving forward, that's where I'm going with Kraut guitars. There is no difference between, if you want a 4-inch diameter sound hole or what I've been calling my Nouveau guitars, it's just going to be a Kraut guitar. It's who I am. And with this is going to be coming, again, I'm not particularly interested in taking custom orders from people. I'm more interested in making the best guitars I can and as authentically as I can for who I am and what I see, what I visualize, what I want to bring into this world. And that whole process I described to you is kind of how I'm getting there. And it feels really good. It feels like for the first, it's not that I didn't have ideas 20 years ago. I always had ideas, but I didn't have the understanding and the experience as to what really goes into a guitar, what makes the differences and what doesn't. And that's what I'm excited to bring and show to people this year and the following years, because it has brought an enormous smile on my face, and I tell people I make the decisions I make in my life are all about how well I sleep at night. And I'm sleeping really well at night these days with this idea that I'm creating guitars for myself as authentically as I can in the ways that inspire me, that when I wake up in the morning, I'm just dying to get to my shop. I can't get there fast enough. And I think that's really important for a builder, at least a builder like me. We're all uniquely different as to what makes us do what we do. But for me, I value the inspiration. I value an outlet in which I can express the feelings that I have towards visual stimulus, and to bring that into something that since I was a child I really loved, which of course is the guitar. It's endlessly exciting for me.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world. Where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive, those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Jamie Gale Music. We are better together, so let's do this together. I love where we've been, and I'm excited about where we're going. This space is normally reserved for brands who make stories like this possible, like the Dario and the Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop. If your company belongs in this conversation, let's talk. We partner with brands who value craft, culture, and the quiet power of a well-placed idea.
I'm very good at drifting in conversation, so you feel free to reel me back in whenever you.
As a matter of fact, I've been thinking we're mostly talked about the same thing for 90 minutes, which is okay because we've explored each little sort of aspect of it. I'm sure we could drive even deeper on it. And we always have to watch the time because we have people who listen to us and and expect to allocate
I can go on all day. So
yeah, well, me too. But that's the problem for our listeners, and so it won't be our last conversation, Ray. But as we're coming up on the 90-minute mark, I generally give back to my guest and say, today as we were thinking about this conversation, this podcast, is there something that you had hoped we would be talking about, a topic that you wanted to discuss today? something you want to challenge me on, say, Jamie, why the hell do you do this? Or or something you want to say about what you're doing that if I were a better interviewer, I might have thought to ask you?
Wow, I think you did a great job. I mean, I know for a long time now that you've been interested in art and the progression of the guitar in regards to it.
Mhm.
And you you know, it happens to be one of my interests as well. And so you jumped
Mhm.
right into that. And of course you've
Mhm.
noticed the differences in my instruments over the last few years. And
Mhm.
it's become because of who I am as a person. I am a reclusive person. I don't get out very much anymore in the world of guitars because I, through experience, have slowly been doing things that are healthy choices for me.
Mhm.
And, shows, for example, are a great method of anxiety for me. I
Mhm.
have a hard time, like, for me, it's overstimulus. I get
Mhm.
really overwhelmed when I go to things like that. And so I dial back and I become more reclusive. I own property in the Sonoran Desert that's 12 miles down a dirt road that most people don't go down.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because I like silence. I like peace in a world
Mhm.
that is very much overstimulating to me.
Mhm.
And, my expression and who I am comes out better when I'm in a place of peace than when I'm being put into a place where I'm constantly anxious and have a hard time, you know, being in essentially. And
Mhm.
so, it's important for me to like, I really am excited to be doing this podcast. This is exciting to me, mostly because I finally reached a place in my career where I feel incredibly confident that not just that I can pull off a guitar like the ones I'm starting to build, but that they're also being accepted in the industry and people are really loving them. And
Mhm.
and to be able to showcase them now means something different to me. And to be able to
Mhm.
talk about that with you here on this podcast means a lot to me as well. There's many more luthiers out there with affability off the charts. Uh, you know, people who
Mhm.
love the excitement and the crowds and the stimulus and the things. I just happen to not be that guy, and to find a balance within myself of what I can do to bring these instruments forward to people and have face to face conversations or virtual conversations like we're having now about what I do. It's
Mhm.
become more important to me now than it ever has been in the past.
Mhm. Mhm.
And uh, so, as far as importance of what we're talking about and have you missed anything, I don't really think you have. I think there's a lot of people out there that know what my guitars sound like already. I've been doing this for a long time.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a lot more Samaji students out there these days than what there used to be. And so the knowledge of what when I say a responsive guitar sounds like, I feel
Mhm.
that a lot of people know what I'm talking about when I say that sound.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
the importance to me is to get out the message that you don't have to be stuck within the confines of what we think of as a traditional guitar in order to have that sound. We can have
Mhm.
both the art and the tone of that style of instrument. And again,
Mhm.
that's why I'll be going to these shows this year. I really encourage people to want to come out and try these things firsthand. And not just for the purposes of, my own guitar selling, but really just, of course, I'm infatuated with this idea of art and guitars being two of the same things. Being
Mhm.
able to bring them in, like what you're doing and the guitars that you represent, and some of the students that I've had in the past and what they're doing now. It's to me, it's all incredibly inspiring, and I love to
Mhm.
see that kind of stuff. And uh, that on the foremost is what I wanted to get out and talk to about in this podcast is
Mhm.
just the art,
Mhm.
how you can achieve tone and art at the same time.
Okay,
And
well, you know what? Let's dial a little bit. We talked about the physics. We talked about why it works. I've mentioned a couple of times that my experience with these instruments so far really, I can attest that you are achieving what you were proclaiming you're trying to achieve. And as far as an instrument that is aesthetically different, expresses different ideas aesthetically, but yet gives the desired response that you want acoustically and performatively. And so let's just talk a little bit about those aesthetics, the art side of things. Art is a big, complicated topic,
Well,
and
well, like
the
music, of
the
course, it's subjective,
it
and
is subjective. Hmm.
I can go on this endlessly as well. And if you like,
Hmm.
I'll tell you about my understanding of art, where it came from, and where my interests lie. Um,
Sure. Let me
I was
hear.
raised in an Air Force family. I've traveled
Hmm.
all over the world. My mother's from New Zealand. My father was born and raised St. Louis. My brother's from Germany. We have lived everywhere. And
Hmm.
I originally hail from Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, up in the Panhandle.
Hmm.
And we've lived in other countries. We've lived all throughout the United States. And within the context of that, I can appreciate it now in ways I didn't appreciate back then, but I did have a lot of culture in my life from a young age.
Hmm.
And especially as a kid, that I feel as though that's a thing within all of us that we kind of take for granted because we really don't know anything different.
Hmm.
Mostly what I hold on to from my childhood when I try to look back on it is architecture
Hmm.
and my love for buildings and shapes. And I think largely that's where my linear interests come from, is because most houses are up, down, left, right, right angles,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
structural sense of things. And I really hold on to that now when I look back at my early childhood. Aside from that, I had no education in art whatsoever.
Hmm.
Sadly, that doesn't, at least in the experience I had as a child, which I know is different from certain students that I've had in the past. Um, we just didn't have it in school in a way where I kind of wish it would have been.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
I think it's pretty obvious to say that in this day and age, there's so many different types of people in this world. And we do a very good job of trying to put people in a box and teach them all the same thing in the same way and get people to think a certain way. But that's just not the way the world works. That's not how humans work. And
Yeah.
so I didn't have that experience as a child.
Hmm.
Like most people, I could look at something and say I like something or I don't like something, but I couldn't tell you why.
Hmm.
I could just say, it's just what I like. And that's what I found a lot of people experience, at least within the United States. And it wasn't until my apprenticeship with Irvin that I really began to understand art and design.
Hmm.
And for those of you out there that don't know, I apprenticed with Irvin Samaji for 2 years in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's a non-paid apprenticeship, so I'm learning from him for the course of 2 years, 6 7 days a week, um, just completely engulfed in learning about guitar building. And of course, it went so far beyond just learning about guitars. It was learning about life itself.
Hmm.
And Irvin is an incredible teacher who taught me, I would argue, way more about life than guitars even. And I learned a lot
Hmm.
about guitars.
Hmm.
And one
Hmm.
of the more beautiful things I learned when I was in the Bay Area is that the first Tuesday of every month was free admission into the majority of all the museums around the Bay Area, which
Hmm.
are quite a few and really quite incredible. And so I'd often find myself at the San Francisco MoMA or the De Young in Golden Gate Park, just exploring art because I never really paid attention to it in the ways that I do now. When I had Irvin try to talk to me about line value, I didn't really grasp the context of what he was trying to explain to me. And
Hmm.
so I would just wander in these museums. And I believe it was in 2005. the San Francisco MoMA had a very particular show going on. It was called Innocence and Insanity, and it was the works, the sketches of Paul Klee. And at the time, I had no idea who Paul Klee was, but it was a pivotal moment in my life. Even thinking about it now, it brings up emotions in me. It was the first emotional experience I ever had at looking at a piece of art. At least I'll say emotional experience that came out of me in the form of crying. Mm-hmm. And I just sat there and wept looking at these drawings. It was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. So here I am trying to learn about line value in art, and I walk into this museum and I'm just floored. I'm stopped in my tracks and naturally fascinated by it. I must have been in there for 4 hours just staring at these drawings. And from that moment forward, I had a better understanding of what it really meant to make something like that and where my interest lied within the context of it. And since then, I've had many experiences like that. But that was the root of it for me. And from there, it was all downhill, so to speak. And but it was fun learning how to incorporate that into what we do, because of course it's very different looking at a painting or a drawing and then feeling inspiration from that. And then what do I do on a guitar, on a piece of wood? And obviously for the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years, that was mostly interpreted in rosette designs and the inlay work that I do. And that has, for the most part of the past 20 years, has slowly evolved into more of who I am. And then again, over the last few years, it's rapidly moved forward into who I am. But that was the early roots of me beginning to understand line value.
And how old were you when you had this experience at the art gallery?
I believe I was my early 20s. I was either 23 or 24 at the time. Okay. And you know, that was a massively pivotal point in my career, because at that point it's almost like that unlocked something within my own mind that allowed me to understand what Irvin was trying to teach me more. And you know, there's this story I've told a lot over the last couple decades about how Irvin taught line value to me. And perhaps you've heard this story before yourself, where I had this bridge that I had made at the Roberta Venn School prior to my apprenticeship with Irvin. And I had sculpted this thing in a way that I was very proud of. I was like, oh man, I just really made something special here. And I'm showing it to Irvin maybe 2 months into my 1 month, 2 months into my apprenticeship. And he grabbed one of his bridges, and then he had my bridge, and he showed them both to me. And he goes, you know, what do you see that's different between these two? And in my undereducated brain, I'm like, nothing. They're both amazing. They're great. You know, they both have interesting characteristics to them. They're going to both make a fantastic bridge. They weigh about the same. Like, everything's great. So again, he takes me to Cafe Pipo across the street, and he's trying to talk to me about line value and keeps showing me the differences between these two bridges. And it's just not connecting. You know, this bridge was broken down, and he's trying to rebuild this thing. And he just can't get through to me. So eventually he takes me back over to his shop where he has a library, and he has me sit down on this futon and starts, while I'm sitting down, he's rummaging through his library trying to find a particular book. And at some point he finds it, sits back down next to me, particularly close to me, I'll say. And to the point where it's like a little uncomfortable. Why are you so close to me? And he starts flipping through this book, and I'm looking down, and this book is just a bunch of nude people. And at this point, again, I'm early into my apprenticeship, and I didn't know who Irvin was prior to my apprenticeship. This was before social media. This was, you know, I mean, even for
Yeah.
me, the internet wasn't a big thing. You know, I had only just bought my first computer before going into my apprenticeship. So I really didn't know who Irvin was. So here he is. He's sitting next to me and he's showing me a book of all these nude people. And he gets to this page where I believe there were 5 people turned with their backs to the camera, fully nude, showcasing 5 different butts. And he looks at me and says in a kind of peculiar way, "Now, Ray, which one of those butts do you like the best?" I'm internally losing my mind at this point because I'm like, what is he getting at here? What is the point of this? And a little uncomfortability came in with me too, because I realized that the person who had the nicest butt on that page happened to have been a male. And at the point, I'm still not connecting what he's trying to do here. He's trying to clear out everything out of my brain and putting me in an uncomfortable situation. And eventually I decided, okay, I just got to say it's this guy's butt, and we'll see where it goes. And I said that to him, and he goes, "Really? No, Ray, why is it that butt that you like the most?" And as I'm sitting there describing the shape of this person's butt versus the shape of everybody else's butt, he then holds these 2 bridges back up in front of my face. And he goes, "Now, which bridge do you like better?" And it was another one of those amazing aha moments where I was like, oh my God, how did I not see that before? And because it was a teaching of line value, whether a butt that was shaped with a nice curve to it or a butt that had like and something that was unpleasing about it. I mean, it was very obvious to see the difference.
Yeah.
And he was able to relate that to me in a way that most people can relate when it comes to the form of a human, what people value as far as a line value is concerned. You put that with like in the context of a thing that most people don't think about every day, like a shape of a bridge.
Yeah.
That can be unknown within our minds, but when you relate it into something that we see and we pay attention to on a daily basis, things can click. And in this instance, that's for better or for worse, that's what it took for me to understand what he was getting to, was to relate it to the shape of a butt.
Yeah. I've been in the room more than once while Irvin tries to extol the virtues of bottoms to guitar makers.
I've heard
he
from
a master class at a show a number of years ago where he tried to get them to understand that a guitar is, when placed vertically, he feels should have a flattening, as if you're sitting on something, that your bum doesn't remain round, that it should have a bit of a flatness there because it's unnatural to remain round. And I think for 20 minutes, he waited for someone to get the answer. He just continued to listen, continued to ask them.
He's very patient in that way.
Yes.
But he's got
every time you say Cafe Pipo, I hear Irvin's voice going, "Do you like flans?" Yes.
I'm hoping to see him here in another. I'm hoping to see him in about a week and a half, and I suspect he's going to ask me again about the flan. We'll see. Cafe Pipo is still around, so I'm sure we will be there having more conversations. These days, they usually exist outside of the realm of guitars and just unique things that happen to have popped into his mind over the last couple of months from the last time I've seen him. Yes, he's an interesting mind. His brain works in different ways than others, but it took him for me to break through and understand what I was trying to get out of myself. Because what I find interesting looking back on it is from day one, before I knew who Irvin was, before I knew that even I could make a living building guitars and not be a guitar factory. Because legitimately, that's what I was doing. I thought when I quit a county job that I had in Phoenix to go to Roberta Vin and study guitar building, I thought my competition was going to be Martin Taylor Gibson and all these big companies. I didn't realize I could build 12 guitars a year, and there was a world of people building guitars already successfully in this way. I had no idea. All I knew is that I wanted to fulfill myself in a way artistically and get back into having my hands on something. I was drawn to it. And even in that, I wanted to not feel like I was being redundant in what I was building time and time again. So I had this innate interest in creating something unique visually at the same time as building guitar from day one. But it wasn't until I was with Irvin and his unique way of getting through into people's minds to sort of unlock what potential a person may or may not have. That's what it took for me. And it has been the most exciting road after that, learning more. And even from my students, sometimes I end up with a student who teaches me something I didn't know, or brings me into like an artist I had never heard of before. In fact, someone whose guitars you showcase regularly, Max Spoon, he's one of those guys. Incredibly talented builder. He is in the same design sense inspiration as I'm in. And I remember having him in my shop, and he was bringing all sorts of new artists into my mind and people I'd never thought about before. And he and I even, when I was in Germany once for the Berlin Guitar Show, he wanted me to fly in, be with him. He would host me for a little bit. We'd drive up to Berlin from where he's located, and we'd go visit his alma mater, as well as going to Bauhaus, which to this day was one of the most inspirational visits to a museum that I've ever been to in my life. I mean, it happens to have been a place where two of my biggest inspirations both taught together at the same time. So it's a little surprise to me now, but it was a very unique and interesting experience, and I have Max to thank for that. And I just love this journey of seeing what other people do with what they have going on inside of their heads and the way that they can translate it into the world. I think it's one of the most beautiful things we can do as humans.
I agree. And to Irvin's credit, to what you said earlier on, a great mentor doesn't make you like them. They help you be you. They bring out who you are.
Right. Exactly right. Now that I recently became a father, and I have a son. Thank you. I have a son who just on June 4th turned 2. And the whole experience of that has been both horrifying and exciting at the same time. The difficulties of raising a little youngster.
Yeah.
But the way I view seeing this little man in my life is so similar to how I now understand Irvin and his teaching. The job isn't to make a little mini me. The job is to be a guide and move this person through their life and be there as a support system, but to bring out and help them bring out the things inside of themselves that make them who they uniquely are. And that makes me better at what I do too. And I never thought in my life that having a child would make me understand even myself more or what I've been through more. But it absolutely did, in very interesting ways that I would have never thought about prior to doing it.
I completely agree. I have 2 children myself who are, they're both married in their late 20s. I have a grandchild almost the age of your son. He's been staying here with us for the last month. They're about to leave in a couple of days. I'm sure I'm going to miss that little guy. But they teach you so much. Your guy, I'm sure, can barely even talk at this point in time. But all the wonderful things and all the bad things, you're like, you little shit. Oh my God, you're just like, oh, they got that from me for sure. You're
right. It's a thing. I say that a lot. My wife says that a lot too. Directed at me.
And then you improve. You improve yourself as you're realizing, oh, I need to help this guy grow up and yeah,
Well,
figure out
there's
a
so
way
many
to navigate the
lessons.
world with a good strategy. And but I think that the fact that you're so curious, Ray, um, is probably the best thing he can possibly learn. Curiosity is the key. Curiosity and a love of learning is the greatest thing we can give to any other person, especially to our children. The world is changing incredibly fast, and learning a particular rule or a particular task in the moment may be completely irrelevant by the time they get around to using it at this stage. So learning how to learn is the most important thing you can possibly teach anyone at this stage.
I believe that to be true, and to follow the curiosity.
Yes.
Not to be fearful of it, not to worry about all the what ifs, because there's plenty of those in the world, but
Yeah.
to unhinged follow your curiosity with everything you have in you and be truly who you are, to me is something very unique. And it's something I've had to, I think this isn't a new narrative. However, it's like I was raised in a very particular way in this world. And when I look back on it, I'm
Mhm.
like, well, that's not really who I was. That's who you wanted me to be.
Mm.
And I've spent a long time unraveling that, learning for myself who I am, whether that's
Mm.
in places I've lived, food that I've had available to me, and just
Mhm.
being open to trying and doing anything to understand what makes me excited. And
Yeah.
I hope and I think that that's what's going to make me a good father to my son, is, again, not trying to make this person into what I believe he or she should be, but paying attention to the things that spark him, that make him really interested in something, and following that with
Mhm.
him, regardless of what it is, and or anything, but allowing a child the opportunity to be creative and follow their
Mhm.
inspiration, I think is a really beautiful thing. And it, I, not to have any disrespect to my parents or people that were in my life back then, but I wish I would have
Mhm.
had more of an opportunity to express myself as a child and learn these things. And in certain ways, I did.
Yeah.
It's my father um, was particularly open to me when I found woodworking.
Mhm.
And even as a child, I was a bit of a reclusive kid. I didn't like school. I didn't like being in crowds. I much preferred, being not necessarily by myself, but in small groups, and finding things that obviously I enjoyed doing.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until it's about when I was a freshman in high school, or even maybe a little before that, there were classes offered in the school that I was attending at the time, which was in Ohio,
Mhm.
where we were able to create things like little motors that spun off of a battery and some magnets, and wrapping
Mhm.
some
Mhm.
copper windings around a dowel rod. And um,
Mhm.
that really sparked me. And then I get into high school and there's shop class, and my dad noticed that, and I will thank him forever, because what he ended up doing for me is going out and buying tools, and he stopped parking in the garage and he set up the garage with a little workshop in it. And
Mhm.
that's where I
Mhm.
ended up spending most of my time. I opened my first business as a sophomore in high school, selling
Mhm.
pens and pencils and bowls out of a hair salon off of their front desk. And all of that was because of my father's ability to see something in me that made me excited, or perhaps happy or different, in a way that he
Yeah.
otherwise saw me. And uh, much to his credit, I think that was a big part of me learning who I was back then. But it took much
Mhm.
more than that for me to sort of get rid of, I'll say, coping mechanisms or different sides of me that have been constructed over the years, to kind of put that aside, to allow myself to open up and be artistic in the way that I want to be,
Mhm.
and vulnerable in the ways that I want to be. That
Mhm.
that took a lot of work. yeah, as a father now, these are the kind of things I'm going to try to offer my son as much as possible. And it's the most inspiring thing I've ever done. So I just can't wait for him to be about 4 or 5.
Yeah. I hear you. So, Ray, that's a wonderful spot to wrap up on. We always do a little bit at the end for those who are in the business of guitar, but we do it behind a paywall. So, for those of you who are interested in the business of guitar, if you're in the guitar business, Ray and I are going to talk for another 2 or 3 minutes, not very long, over in the business of guitar, which you can find at patreon.com/business of guitar. Again, that's patreon.com/the business of guitar. And Ray's got a different approach. He has a few different businesses, as far as I know. And we'll talk about what it's like to be a guitar maker in business and get a little advice from him. So, Ray, thank you for joining us on Life with Strings Attached. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I hope it's not our last one. And I'm looking forward to trying those guitars in Chicago.
Thank you for having me on, and I look forward to seeing you and your family in Chicago.
Wonderful. Take care for now. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Life with Strings Attached. If today's conversation meant something to you, consider passing it on. These stories find their place through the people who share them. A new episode comes out every Friday, right here, wherever you're listening. I'm Jamie Gale, and thanks for listening to Life with Strings Attached.